Have you ever trusted someone so much that you thought nothing could shake that relationship, and suddenly, in an instant, everything fell apart? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. My name is Sarah Miller. I have 42 years old. I'm a Christian, and I never imagined that a simple video would have the power to destroy not only my trust in my husband, but also the way I viewed love, faith, and even myself. Warning, what I'm about to share here will leave you speechless. I was seen as a woman of faith, someone who had the perfect marriage, a seemingly solid life built on Christian principles. People looked at me and said, "What an exemplary wife, what an exemplary family." And for a long time, I believed it myself. Until one day, unexpectedly, a message arrived on my phone. Inside, a video. And that video changed everything. The scene is still etched in my mind. My hands were shaking, my heart was racing, and it felt like the ground beneath my feet had disappeared. What I saw there wasn't just marital betrayal. It was as if my entire history had been ripped apart before my eyes. The man with whom I shared prayers, plans, and dreams was in another reality, a reality that excluded me completely. Has anyone else here experienced something similar? The feeling of being betrayed by the one you loved most? And the most painful part wasn't just the video itself, but everything that came after. The suffocating silence at home, the judgment from the people who should have supported me, the weight of abandonment, and the feeling that my voice wasn't heard. I know, it's hard to even imagine, but trust me, the end of this story is worth it. And that's precisely why I decided to share every detail of my journey, so that no woman going through something similar feels alone. Because the pain is real, the shock is devastating, but there's something beyond that, and I'm going to tell you. But first, let me go back to the beginning of this story. Before everything happened, I was just an ordinary, simple, and dedicated woman. I grew up believing that family was a sacred foundation, and that when we build something on faith, nothing can shake it. In the eyes of others, I was that exemplary wife, active in church, always smiling, always available to help, whether in meetings, prayer groups, or visiting families in need. I truly believed that my future was secure with a man who claimed to share the same faith and values. And it wasn't just a matter of appearance. Deep down, I was proud of the life I was building. I would wake up early, make coffee, leave everything in order, and rejoice in seeing my home functioning as a space of peace and comfort. Often, while washing dishes or folding clothes, my thoughts would be filled with a sense of gratitude. I would repeat to myself, "Thank you, Lord, because my life may not be perfect, but I have everything I need." My identity was deeply connected to the role of wife and woman of faith. I was the one who believed that love endured all things, that prayer healed any wound, and that, with patience and dedication, marriage only grew stronger. At church, I was seen as a role model. Younger women would come to me for marriage advice, and I spoke with the conviction of someone who believed she was living exactly what she preached. I'd say things like, "If you pray for your husband, nothing can go wrong," or "When God is the center, the home is unshakable." I believed these phrases so much that it never occurred to me that the hidden truth might be quite different. What I didn't know was that behind the scenes, what seemed solid had invisible cracks. I didn't realize it myself because my mindset was shaped by a blind, almost naive confidence that nothing could threaten what I considered sacred. And it's precisely this contrast that makes my journey so painful. The feeling of living a stable dream, while in reality a storm was brewing, was what shook me most afterward. It wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was the impact of discovering that everything I believed about stability, security, and the very idea of eternal love could crumble in seconds. I thought I'd made all the right decisions, that my life was protected by an invisible wall of faith, but the revelation showed me that I wasn't as safe as I thought. Let's explore the deeper side of this issue together, because understanding who I was before everything is essential to understanding the intensity of what came after. People always looked at us with that sparkle in their eyes, as if they were witnessing an unshakable love story. The perfect couple at church, the family many held up as an example. My husband and I were constantly invited to counsel other couples, to give testimonies about how faith strengthened our union, and I confess, I believed every word they said. I believed because, from the outside, everything seemed truly solid. There was a certain pride in being seen as a role model, in walking down the aisles of the church hand in hand, in hearing comments like, "You are proof that God still truly unites people." This filled me with hope and reinforced my belief that my home was protected by a spiritual wall that nothing could break down. What no one saw was what was behind the scenes. I didn't see it either. The small flaws, the awkward silences, the moments when I noticed his distant gaze, as if he were in another world. I ignored these signs because it was easier to believe the constructed image. It's amazing how the human mind can cling to that which brings comfort, even when the hidden truth is knocking at the door. I clung to the idea that every relationship goes through phases, that some attitudes could be justified by work fatigue, routine, or even common distractions. And, amidst all this, I remained steadfast, nurturing the illusion of stability. In front of everyone, we were the couple who prayed together, who smiled at Sunday lunch, who talked about future plans. Inside, I felt small cracks, but I always chose to remain silent, always believing it was just a phase. This decision to remain silent, to not question, made me believe for years in a narrative that wasn't entirely true. Today, looking back, I realize the impact this choice had on my life, the way I overlooked important signs, the way my own voice was silenced in the name of peace at home. Still, at the time, nothing seemed wrong enough to make me doubt. I saw our life as a protected journey, a solid construction built on prayer and spiritual discipline. And perhaps it was precisely this conviction that made everything more devastating when the mask fell. Because the higher you believe you are, the more painful the fall. And I didn't yet know that mine was about to happen so brutally, so unexpectedly, that it would leave deep scars on my life. It was like living on a brightly lit stage, unaware that behind the scenes, something dark was stirring, ready to surface. And when that happens, there's no way to see things the same way again. The transformation that follows is inevitable, but at that moment, I was still blinded by the brilliance of the image I held. And it is precisely in this contrast between appearance and reality that my story takes on even more intense contours, because it was there, in the midst of this seemingly perfect life, that the first crack began to open, silent and cruel, announcing that something much greater was about to be revealed. I used to believe I lived in an indestructible fortress, surrounded by the faith and respect we received within the community. But little by little, I realized that this perfect image was more fragile than I could have imagined. It's curious how, sometimes, life presents us with unexpected revelations, and suddenly everything that seemed solid begins to crumble before our eyes. And it's precisely by sharing stories like this, full of hidden truths, lessons learned, and transformation, that I feel this conversation needs to reach more women who may be experiencing something similar in silence. So if this topic resonates with you, if it somehow touches your heart, or brings back memories of times when you also needed strength to move forward, subscribe to the channel. It's not just about following my story, but about being part of a community where we can support each other, share our pain, and celebrate our victories. Your participation here is what makes this space grow, reaching more people who need to hear messages like this and showing that no one is alone on this journey. And when you subscribe, you'll not only follow what I have to say, but you'll also join a network of women who believe that even after the impact of betrayal, loss, or abandonment, there's still hope. Every comment, every gesture, every subscription is like a seed planted so that other lives can be transformed. I know that opening my heart and reliving certain memories isn't easy, but I'm convinced that by sharing this experience, it can become a light on the path for someone who feels lost today. And it's like this, little by little, that we continue to unite, giving voice to what has so often been silenced. Because the truth is that behind every story lies a backdrop full of emotions, difficult decisions, and revelations that can change everything. And it was precisely at this point in my journey that things began to take on a new shape, something I could never have predicted, but which would completely change the way I saw my world. I took deep pride in my role as a wife. For me, it wasn't just a function within the marriage, it was a mission. I believed that being faithful, serving with love, and always ready to support my husband was a way of expressing my faith in action. Every day, I made a point of praying beside him, before bed or first thing in the morning, believing that this moment strengthened not only our union, but also our purpose before God. With every simple gesture, preparing a meal, tidying the house, supporting his projects, I saw an opportunity to reaffirm my commitment to the love I promised at the altar. I often heard sermons about the importance of a wise wife, one who builds her home with words of encouragement, who supports her family in prayer, and who chooses humility even in difficult times. I took this so seriously that I began to demand more of myself than I should have. I thought that if something went wrong between us, the responsibility would fall on me, as if I had failed to live up to the Bible's teachings. This mindset shaped the way I viewed my marriage, constantly placing me in a position of giving, even when, behind the scenes, I was already beginning to feel the weight of the imbalance. I often believed that serving meant giving up on myself. I put their wishes above my own, accepted silences that bothered me, and on several occasions failed to express my feelings to avoid conflict. I saw this as proof of maturity, as part of the journey of becoming a wise and dedicated woman. Today, I understand that there was a hidden truth there. I confused submission with oblivion. I confused patience with silence. I confused love with completely relinquishing my voice. Even so, at that time, I remained convinced I was on the right path. The impact of believing that my dedication was the key to keeping everything going made me ignore the signs of wear and tear. I believed that if I remained steadfast, if I was tireless in my prayers, and if I didn't allow myself to be discouraged, our marriage would continue to be an example of transformation and hope for others. And so, day after day, I nurtured this role, unaware that the decisions I made to sustain the relationship were actually preventing me from seeing what was happening behind the scenes. It's strange to look back and realize how the mindset of devotion can, without us realizing it, become an emotional trap. I felt proud to be the devoted wife, but at the same time, unconsciously, I was allowing my world to revolve around someone who no longer revolved around me. It was like walking on ground that seemed solid, but was beginning to crack without me having the courage to look down. And it was precisely in this scenario of almost blind surrender and faith that my story began to take an unexpected turn, revealing behind-the-scenes details I never would have dared to imagine. Over time, small changes began to appear, almost imperceptible, but which, within me, awakened a silent discomfort. He would come home late, saying he was overwhelmed at work, and I accepted it without question. Conversations that once flowed naturally became shorter, almost mechanical, as if the words had lost the warmth they had always carried. Sometimes I noticed that, while I spoke, his gaze was distant, fixed on some empty spot, as if his body were present, but his mind wandered elsewhere. These moments bothered me, but the mentality I carried as a faithful and patient wife made me justify it. It's just a phase, he's tired. Everything will soon return to normal. I remember one night preparing his favorite meal and waiting for the smile that always came in response. But this time, he simply ate in silence, got up from the table, and went to his room. I stood there, observing the details of the scene, trying to understand what had happened, but I quickly found an excuse within myself. Perhaps he was worried about some bill, some project that hadn't come to fruition, some pressure I wasn't aware of. And so, one by one, I fed excuses that helped me ignore the signs. Our shared prayers, which had always been a cornerstone of our relationship, began to dwindle. Before, it was natural for us to kneel side by side. Suddenly, he'd say he was sleepy or prefer to pray alone. This pained me, but I convinced myself it was only a matter of time. My decision not to confront, not to bring this discomfort to the surface, stemmed from the belief that questioning too much could generate conflict. And I believed that maintaining peace was more important than bringing even a shadow of doubt to the surface. Today, I understand that that estrangement wasn't sudden. It was gradual, built on small choices, on gestures that carried a hidden truth, but which I didn't have the courage to see. Every disguised absence, every lost glance, every prolonged silence was like a subtle warning, but I clung to the image of stability I had created in my mind. It was more comfortable to believe in the narrative of a solid marriage than to admit that something was breaking within it. This process of ignoring the signs had a profound impact on the way I viewed life. I was so caught up in the idea of keeping everything running smoothly that I didn't realize that, behind the facade, the scenes were falling apart. The curious thing is that, even though I felt a tightness in my chest, I kept quiet, convinced it was just my own insecurity. But deep down, there was something inside me that I already knew. The distance wasn't just physical or emotional. It was a silent revelation that something bigger was about to happen. And it was on this shaky ground, between justifications and waiting, that my journey began to move toward a point of no return, where the impact of the truth would be impossible to ignore. That night is still etched in my memory, as if it had happened yesterday. I was on the couch, scrolling through my phone without much expectation, when an unexpected notification arrived. It was an anonymous message, with no name, no context. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I opened the file, the screen lit up my face, and within seconds, my world collapsed. I saw there an image of my husband with another woman in an intimacy I never imagined I would witness. My body reacted before my mind comprehended. My hands began to shake uncontrollably, my heart raced, and it felt like the air had drained from the room. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if my body wanted to shield me from the pain about to invade my soul. I clutched my phone to my chest, as if I could hide it from myself, as if closing my eyes would be enough to erase what I'd already seen. But the scene was etched within me, impossible to undo. My breath became shallow, the ground seemed to have disappeared, and all that remained was a deafening void. The mind is treacherous in these moments. In a matter of seconds, 1,000 thoughts raced through me. Did I see correctly? Was it really him? Could someone have made it up? But the truth was laid bare before my eyes, leaving no room for doubt or illusion. The impact was so strong that I felt as if a part of me had died right there, before that cold screen that delivered the cruelest revelation I could ever receive. It was as if the entire theater of my life had been dismantled in the snap of a finger. The scenes I hadn't seen before came crashing back to the surface, revealing the hidden truth I'd avoided facing. That man, with whom I'd shared prayers, dreams, and promises, was in another setting, living in a parallel reality where I didn't exist. The pain was physical, sharp, almost palpable. I was shaking so hard I dropped my cell phone on the floor, and the sound echoed in the silent room, a cruel reminder that nothing would ever be the same again. In that moment, I realized the weight of the decisions I'd made. Over the years, every justification, every silence, every moment I'd chosen to believe what comforted me rather than look for the signs. Everything seemed to take on new meaning, and that meaning hurt. It was as if every detail of our story was being rewritten before my eyes, now tinged with the shadow of betrayal. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my legs felt trapped. It was like being in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. And deep down, a question began to echo insistently. If what I believed was a lie, then who was I in that relationship? This questioning followed me from the first second after the discovery, and was what began to shape the most painful transformation of my life. I knew that nothing would ever be the same, and that every step from then on would be marked by this brutal revelation that had taken my breath away. And it was in this state of shock, with my mind in collapse and my heart in pieces, that the next movement of my journey began to take shape, even though I didn't have the strength to understand where it would take me. In that instant, I felt as if my heart had been ripped from my chest without warning, as if someone had pulled out the most vital part of me, leaving only an empty space, pulsing with pain. The shock of discovery wasn't just new information. It was a profound, almost physical invasion that paralyzed me. I could barely breathe, and when I tried, it was as if the air came in fragments, tearing from within. Every beat of my heart seemed to scream that this couldn't be true, that there was some mistake, some plausible explanation I hadn't yet found. But the image was there, vivid, cruel, tattooed on my eyes. I felt shattered. The trust I had cultivated for years like a rare plant was crushed in seconds. It wasn't just a matter of marital betrayal. It was the feeling that everything I had experienced up until that point had lost its meaning. The man I considered my companion, the man I dreamed of growing old with, had suddenly become a stranger, and amidst so much despair, loneliness was present as never before. I was there, inside my house, surrounded by familiar walls, but it was as if I had been thrown into a silent desert. The pain was so intense, it wasn't limited to my chest. It spread throughout my entire body, burning my eyes, shaking my hands, gnawing at my core. I wanted to cry, but even the tears were slow to come, as if trapped by a deep knot. And when they finally came, they weren't tears of relief, but of despair, of loss, of a grief that had no body but carried weight. It felt like I was experiencing the death of something I'd believed to be eternal. The cruelest thing was the avalanche of memories that immediately followed. Every prayer said together, every hug before bed, every kind word spoken in public now seemed part of a rehearsed script, as if there were behind-the-scenes events I'd never known. The hidden truth imposed itself upon me with violence, revealing that the life I'd believed solid was full of cracks. The impact wasn't just emotional, it was existential. I asked myself, if he wasn't who I thought, then who am I in this story? Where is my identity, my dignity, my faith? It's in these moments that the mind desperately searches for answers, as if clinging to an explanation would be enough to lessen the pain. But there was no answer. There was only emptiness and the painful realization that my journey would be forever, marked by this moment. And yet, as I writhed between unanswered questions and memories that now seemed distorted, a new layer of this reality began to form, one that would force me to face difficult decisions, changes in mindset, and revelations even more painful than I could bear. I took a deep breath before looking for him. My body was still shaking, but I knew I couldn't keep it to myself. When I showed him my phone and told him what I'd seen, he froze for a moment, as if caught off guard, but quickly recovered. He denied it firmly, almost aggressively, saying it wasn't him, that the video could have been manipulated, that someone was trying to destroy our family. For a brief moment, part of me wanted to believe him, because it was easier to cling to the possibility that it was all a mistake than to face the cruel revelation I already had inside my chest. But as I persisted, demanding explanations, his tone changed. Indifference took over, as if he were tired of the conversation. His answers became curt, cold, and impatient. There was no longer any effort to prove his innocence, not even a plea for forgiveness. Just a wall erected before me, a wall of silence and contempt that left me even more shattered. With each cutting word, the chasm between us widened. It was at that moment that I realized that what hurt most wasn't just the video itself, but the way he reacted. The initial denial was painful, but the subsequent indifference was devastating. It was as if I had stopped mattering, as if all the years of dedication, fidelity, and building a life together could be dismissed with a simple, cold stare. The lack of remorse was an invisible punch, a cruel reminder that I was alone in this pain. I expected at least an attempt at an explanation, a word that would make some sense, a minimal confession that might open the door to dialogue. But what I received was silence, and within that silence lay an even harsher hidden truth. He wasn't willing to fight. Not for me, not for what we'd built. It was at that moment that my mindset began to shift. I was no longer faced with a failed husband, but with a stranger who treated me as if I were a burden. The impact of this confrontation was greater than I could have imagined. I felt small, as if I had lost not only my trust, but also my right to exist within that relationship. It was an emptiness mixed with anger, shame, and a sadness that seemed endless. And yet, a part of me still searched for answers, still, trying to understand how someone I shared my life with could look me in the eye with such indifference. It was in this scenario that the distance between us stopped being invisible and became an insurmountable wall, marking the beginning of an even more painful journey, full of revelations I never thought I would have to face. After that confrontation, what settled between us wasn't an endless argument, nor a storm of accusations, but a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to invade every corner of the house. Conversations, which had previously been rhythmic, light, and even full of laughter, were transformed into short answers, sentences interrupted by indifference. The sound of coldness hurt more than any scream, because in the silence I heard the absence of love, the absence of effort, the absence of us. It was as if two people shared the same space but lived in parallel worlds with no common ground. This silence had a devastating impact. It wasn't empty. It was charged with hidden meaning. Every time I tried to strike up a conversation and received only a distant look or a dry response, it was as if my heart was reminded that I no longer had a place in that relationship. The indifference made me feel invisible, and the invisibility somehow hurt more than the betrayal itself, because deep down, a part of me still wished he would fight, that he would at least show some interest in explaining, in rebuilding, in repenting. But all I received was silence, and this silence consumed me because it forced me to talk to myself. I constantly asked myself, is it me? Have I stopped being enough? Have I at some point lost the spark he sought in another woman? It was a spiral of doubts and questions that eroded my identity. His silence fueled my insecurity and made me believe that perhaps I was to blame for everything. I tried to convince myself that there was still hope, but deep down, I already knew that this distance was a revelation in itself, a backdrop that said much more than any words could express. Sometimes I wished there had been an explosion, a fight, a venting, because at least that would have brought movement, shown that something still existed. But what there was a wall of coldness that grew taller each day, making it clear that his decision had already been made long before I found out. And I, trying to hold on to the fragments of a life that was falling apart, found myself increasingly suffocated, trapped in a silence that screamed within me, announcing that the next step of this journey would be even more painful. The silence at home was painful enough, but what happened when the truth began to spread was an even harder blow to bear. I always imagined that if I ever faced a crisis, my faith community would be a safe haven, a place where I could find support and an outstretched hand. But reality showed me that not everyone's shoulders were willing to bear my weight. Some people embraced me immediately, prayed with me, and cried alongside me, like true brothers and sisters who understood the depth of my pain. But at the same time, others looked at me with suspicion, as if the blame for that betrayal could somehow fall on me as well. Hearing phrases like, "Maybe you weren't a good wife," or "Maybe you didn't take good care of your home," was like being stabbed with invisible knives. I was already fragile, trying to pick up the pieces of a shattered life, and yet I still had to deal with the judgment of those I believed would support me. It was as if, instead of acknowledging the gravity of the betrayal, some preferred to see flaws in me, as if it were more comfortable to believe I had failed than to admit that someone in a prominent position within the church could have committed such a cruel act. This kind of judgment eroded my self-esteem even more deeply. I spent entire nights awake, wondering if I hadn't really done enough, if my prayers weren't intense, if my actions weren't right, if my dedication wasn't genuine. It was a silent struggle against doubt, because in addition to facing the impact of betrayal, I now also carried the distrust of people who should have been a source of encouragement. The transformation this period brought was painful, because it forced me to rethink my mindset about community, support, and even faith lived collectively. Behind the scenes, I realized something I'd previously missed. When the masks fall, many prefer to preserve the appearance of normalcy, even if it means pointing the finger at those already hurt. This revelation was harsh because it showed me that not everyone was prepared to see the hidden truth, the one that exposes the flaws and frailties of people held up as role models. So, instead of full acceptance, I found divisions, words of support mixed with criticism that hurt even more. The experience of being judged at a time when I most needed care left deep scars. It wasn't just about dealing with the pain of abandonment at home, but also the feeling of being alone in an environment that had always felt like a spiritual home. This loneliness within my own community made me question not only the relationship, but also the way I understood faith and the people who professed it. And it was in this context of support, mixed with judgment, that the next phase of my journey began to take shape, revealing that there was still much more to face than I could have imagined. The day he left home still echoes in my memory as one of those moments that divide life into before and after. There was no grand speech, no apology, no attempt to repair the damage. It was just the sound of a door closing, a silence deeper than any other we'd ever experienced. I stood there, motionless, watching the bags being taken away, and it seemed as if each piece of clothing he put in the car ripped away a piece of the history we'd built. The impact was so brutal that for a few seconds I felt like my body no longer belonged to me, as if I were outside the scene, watching from afar the disintegration of my own life. At that moment, what consumed me most was not just the pain of loss, but the emptiness that had set in. Home, once my refuge, now felt like an abandoned field. The walls that had witnessed laughter, prayers, and future plans became mere reminders of something that no longer existed. I walked through the house, and every corner brought a painful revelation. The empty chair in the dining room, the untouched pillow on the side of the bed, the toothbrush that would no longer be used. Everything that was everyday became symbols of absence, reminders that my family was falling apart before my eyes. The final abandonment wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, and psychological. I felt as if I'd been left alone amidst ruins, forced to deal with the aftermath of a life I hadn't chosen. And the hidden truth is that despite all the pain, a part of me already knew this moment would come. The signs were there, but I chose to believe in the illusion of stability. When the door closed, it wasn't just him who left. It was also the image of security I carried within me. It's hard to explain the feeling of watching a family fall apart. It's like the ground shattering into 1,000 pieces, and you have to learn to walk on the shards, trying not to cut yourself further. The silence after their departure was deafening, but filled with memories that pulled me back. With each memory, an internal struggle raged between the pain of loss and the need to move on. I still didn't have answers, but I already sensed that this journey wouldn't just be one of mourning. It would also be one of transformation. Abandonment forced me to face a new reality, to make choices I never imagined I'd have to make. And even though at that moment I only saw emptiness, a part of me began to understand that this rupture would be the starting point for even deeper discoveries, revelations, that would change not only the way I saw marriage, but also the way I saw myself. When the house was empty of his presence, what remained was a battle even more difficult than all the previous ones, the struggle within myself. On one side, my faith, which had always taught me about forgiveness, grace, and mercy. On the other, a wounded soul, bleeding inside, crying out for justice, for revenge, for any form of reparation that would restore my dignity. It was as if two voices competed for space within my mind every second. The first repeated, "Forgive, because that is what Christ would do." The second screamed, "Don't let this pain pass by unnoticed. Make him feel the same way you felt." And amidst these voices, I was lost, unsure of which path to follow. I prayed, but often my words were torn apart by anger. I asked God to help me release forgiveness, but in the next instant, I wished he would experience the same loneliness he had imposed on me. This conflict consumed me. I knew forgiveness was the key to transformation, but I felt that forgiving too soon could be like passively accepting what had happened, as if I were lessening the impact of the betrayal. And at the same time, holding on to resentment ate away at me, like a slow poison that spread through my thoughts, stealing my strength and contaminating even the moments when I wanted to find peace. It was during this process that I realized that forgiveness isn't a button you press. It's not a single, instantaneous decision. It's a journey full of ups and downs, of days when we manage to take one step and others when it feels like we've taken 3 steps back. The hidden truth I discovered is that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or justifying, but about freeing ourselves from the emotional prison that keeps us chained to what happened. But understanding this in theory didn't make it easier to practice. Every time I remembered the video, the silence, the indifference, it felt impossible to let go of. This pain, the devoted Christian wife mentality, was still ingrained in me, and I wondered if God expected me to simply move on, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to obey my faith, but I also wanted to be honest with my pain, and perhaps that was the hardest part. Admitting to myself that I wasn't ready, that forgiveness wouldn't come immediately, that there was a healing process I would need to go through before I could release my heart. This dilemma showed me how complex we are, how life's most important decisions aren't always clear-cut. Between obedience to faith and the cry of a wounded soul, there was a narrow path I still needed to discover. And it was in this space of internal conflict, of tears and unfinished prayers, that I began to realize that the struggle with forgiveness would be one of the most intense and revealing journeys of my life. The weight of not being able to speak was almost as suffocating as the betrayal itself. I found myself carrying a secret that burned inside, but at the same time seemed impossible to express. There was shame, this cruel shadow that made me believe that if I revealed what had happened, people would look at me as a failed woman, incapable of keeping her own home afloat. It was as if the pain wasn't enough, and I still had to deal with the constant fear of being judged, of hearing comments that would reinforce my wounds. And within this imposed silence, I shrank ever deeper, holding back tears no one saw. I walked the church, aisles with a practiced smile, because it was easier to maintain the image of a strong woman than to admit I was broken. At every service, every social gathering, I felt the contrast between what I showed on the outside and what I carried inside. Silence became a prison, a cramped space where the truth couldn't breathe. And at the same time, there was the fear of exposing too much, of opening my mouth and being misinterpreted, of seeing my pain transformed into gossip behind the scenes in the community. It felt like walking a tightrope, trying to balance the need to vent and the obligation to remain silent. This silence also revealed a hidden truth. Women often learn to suppress their voices to protect their family's image, as if preserving their reputation were more important than healing the wound. I myself believed that if I told everything, not only would he be exposed, but I would also be judged. This mindset made me feel complicit in the pain, forced to keep something inside. That was destroying my emotional health. The nights were the worst. The emptiness of the room seemed to amplify the thoughts I tried to hide during the day. I wondered how many other women were living the same reality, trapped in the same silence, carrying the same fear of sharing their stories. The impact this had on my journey was devastating, because I began to doubt my own worth. Did my voice carry weight? Was my pain legitimate? Or did I need to keep hiding everything in the name of a peace that no longer existed? This silence wasn't just an absence of words. It was a psychological prison that prevented me from moving forward. I wanted to speak. I wanted to scream. I wanted to release all the weight I was carrying, but each attempt was stifled by fear of the consequences. And it was precisely in this process of silence that I realized how much I still had to face, because keeping so much inside wouldn't protect me from the impact of reality. It would only postpone the inevitable revelation that was about to surface. The nights became my greatest enemy. During the day, I still managed to distract myself with obligations, household chores, and the need to appear normal in front of others. But when darkness fell and silence took over, no mask could resist. The pillow soaked with tears became part of my routine, as if each drop reflected what I didn't have the courage to show the world. Lying alone, I remembered how it was before, the warmth of someone beside me, the soft conversations before bed, the shared prayer that made me feel protected. And suddenly, all of that was ripped away, replaced by an emptiness that seemed to devour my hope, little by little. The contrast between who I was before and who I was becoming was brutal. Before, I was the confident, dedicated woman, full of plans and convictions. Now, I saw myself as someone broken, trying to put together pieces that no longer fit together the same way. The mirror returned a tired, dull look, as if reflecting not only physical exhaustion, but also the weight of my soul. I constantly asked myself, how did I get here? Where was that woman who believed nothing could shake her faith and her marriage? This forced transformation left me feeling grounded, because it was as if my identity had been ripped away, along with the trust I had placed in the other. The solitude of the nights also brought thoughts I was afraid to admit. I wavered between pain and anger, between longing and the desire to never see him again. There were moments when I wished I could wake up and discover it was all just a nightmare, but soon reality would return with a vengeance, reminding me that the abandonment was real and irreversible. This constant oscillation gnawed at my heart and demanded from me a resilience I wasn't sure I possessed. It was like walking through a desert, where every step was uncertain, and the thirst for answers was never quenched. And yet, amidst this scenario, something inside me began to stir. Perhaps it was the survival instinct. Perhaps it was the whisper of faith trying to rescue me. I wasn't sure, but there was a spark that refused to die. Because deep down, I understood that the journey wouldn't end in that tear-soaked bed. The impact of those lonely nights was shaping something in me, even if I couldn't define what it was. And it was in this realm of silent pain that I began to realize that my story was just beginning to reveal layers I never imagined I would face. Fear of the future began to haunt me like a shadow that wouldn't budge, even on the brightest days. The nights were already heavy, but the mornings were accompanied by questions that hammered relentlessly in my mind. How will I raise my children alone? How will I support the home without him? How will I rebuild my life after so much destruction? The uncertainty was like a maze with no exit, and each thought led me to another, even more distressing one. I found myself facing an unknown road, where nothing I had previously planned made sense. My vision of the future had always been simple: growing old alongside him, watching our children grow up in a structured home, continuing to serve in the church with the same dedication. But now, all that had been ripped away, and what remained was only a void filled with doubt. The impact of this change wasn't just emotional, it impacted my mentality in a devastating way. I had to face the harsh revelation that nothing would be the same, that my decisions from then on would be lonely and often painful. I looked at my children's innocent faces and felt a mixture of love and despair. Love, because they were my reason not to give up. Despair, because I didn't know if I had the strength to give them everything they deserved. The weight of responsibility crushed me, and I wondered if I could support the household, pay the bills, cope with the absence of a father I had chosen to abandon. It was as if I carried on my shoulders not only the pain of betrayal, but also the obligation to keep everything together, even when my heart was in ruins. And in this fearful scenario, I realized that my greatest enemy was no longer him, but the inner voice that insisted on reminding me of my weaknesses. This voice told me I wasn't enough, that I couldn't handle it, that my life was doomed to be a series of defeats. Yet, amidst these shadows, a seed of transformation began to emerge. Because even as I felt small, there was something inside me that refused to give up. Maybe it was faith, maybe it was a mother's instinct, maybe it was simply the flame of survival, but something inside me insisted on believing that this couldn't be the end of my story. Still, I had no answers. Fear of the future continued to haunt me, and each unanswered question seemed to open another wound. I didn't know how I would move forward, but I understood that, somehow, I would need to find the strength to lift my head, and it was on this fragile terrain, amidst tears and uncertainty, that new steps began to take shape, steps that would lead me on a journey I never could have imagined. Amidst the chaos of my thoughts and the crushing weight of an uncertain future, I found myself searching for something that could give me some kind of direction. The silent house seemed to scream at me, and the emptiness of the days was so cruel that even breathing seemed like a chore. It was in this scenario that, almost exhausted, I opened the Bible in search of answers. I wasn't expecting immediate revelation, but simply a breath of fresh air, a fragment of hope that would help me endure another day. And almost inexplicably, my eyes fell on a passage in Isaiah that said, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." In that moment, the words weren't just letters on a page. They pierced my heart like a balm, as if God had chosen to speak directly to me. My body was still weak, my mind still confused, but something inside me regained its breath. It was as if a small, almost extinguished flame had been rekindled. For the first time in a long time, I felt that perhaps I wasn't completely alone, that there was a greater power sustaining me even when everything around me had crumbled. This promise didn't erase the pain or eliminate the unanswered questions, but it gave me a new mindset. I realized I didn't have to carry all the weight alone, that there was an invisible hand supporting me behind the scenes, even when I couldn't see it. This revelation had a profound impact on my journey because it began to transform the way I viewed the future. Instead of merely fearing, I began to envision the possibility of reconstruction, of transformation, of decisions guided not by pain, but by faith. I clutched the Bible to my chest like a shield. I cried, but this time the tears weren't just tears of sadness. There was a hint of hope in them, a whisper that the story wasn't over yet. It was an intimate, almost secret moment between me and God where I realized that my fragility wasn't an impediment, but an opportunity to experience His care even more deeply. This encounter with Isaiah wasn't just a reading. It was a revelation that changed my inner rhythm. I still had open wounds. I still carried painful memories. But now there was something new within me, a promise that sustained me. And it was from this renewed flame that I began to take different steps, small steps, but ones that indicated that despite everything, I was moving towards something greater than the pain that had tried to destroy me. When Isaiah's words resonated within me, something began to shift. For the first time, I realized I didn't need to continue clinging to a marriage that was already destroyed, as if my life depended on it. I understood there was a profound difference between fighting for a dead relationship and fighting for myself, for my dignity, for the woman I could still become. It was at that point that I decided I wouldn't give in to despair. The pain was still real, the wound still bled, but within me a conviction grew. I might have lost a husband, but I would not lose myself. This decision wasn't sudden or easy. It came from many nights of tears, from prayers asking for the strength to get out of bed and continue caring for my children, from moments when the fear of the future seemed greater than any promise of hope. But little by little, I began to understand that every choice I made from then on would need to be aligned with a new purpose, to rebuild not what was broken, but what was still within me. This mindset freed me from the burden of trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved, and gave me back the responsibility of caring for what was within my reach, my faith, my emotional health, my life. The hidden truth I discovered is that we women are often taught to believe that our identity is tied to marriage, as if our existence only has value if we are with someone. And it was precisely this mindset that I needed to break within myself. Choosing not to fight for that relationship didn't mean defeat, but transformation. It was a courageous decision to face the impact of separation and still believe that I could flourish again. I began to realize that dignity can't be begged for, negotiated, and certainly not sustained by lies. Dignity is a daily choice. It's saying to yourself, I deserve more than crumbs of love. I deserve respect. I deserve peace. This revelation gave me the strength to take the first steps out of the cycle of humiliation I was experiencing. I was still afraid, still crying silently, but now each tear was accompanied by the certainty that I wasn't giving up. I was simply crossing the valley that would lead me to a new beginning. And so, with this decision engraved in my heart, I began to chart a different journey, marked not by the failure of a marriage, but by the strength of a woman who chose not to lose herself in pain. A journey that would still bring challenges, trials, and internal battles, but which already carried within it the beginning of a silent victory, the victory of not giving up on myself. After deciding not to give up, I understood that simply wanting to keep going wouldn't be enough. I needed to take concrete steps, even if small, even if staggered. That's when I realized that rebuilding isn't an isolated act, but a journey of daily choices, of conscious decisions that, little by little, would pull me out of the abyss. I sought professional help because I knew carrying everything alone would be too much. In therapy sessions, I found a space where my tears weren't judged, where my questions weren't seen as weakness. There, I could see more clearly behind the scenes of my own story, understanding that my pain wasn't a sign of failure, but part of a human process of loss and transformation. At the same time, I sought to strengthen my spiritual support. Turning to God was no longer just a religious ritual, but an intimate encounter that sustained me when human strength ran out. Prayers, once a shared habit in my marriage, became a personal dialogue, a sincere conversation where I poured out my fears and received in return comfort and guidance. It was in this secret place that I found a new mindset, that I didn't need to have all the answers to keep going. I just needed to believe I wasn't walking alone. But rebuilding also involved self-care, something I had long neglected. I began to look at my health with new eyes, to eat better, to engage in activities that restored my energy, to reclaim the small pleasures I had abandoned. Taking care of myself again wasn't just about aesthetics or routine. It was an act of dignity, a reminder that I still deserved life, color, and movement. It was as if each act of self-care was a revelation that I could indeed begin again, even amid the scars of what I had experienced. These steps didn't erase the pain all at once, but they helped me transform it into fuel. Each day, I felt like I was rebuilding not just a routine, but a new version of myself, more aware, stronger, and more determined not to be defined by the wounds of the past. And it was in this process of silent but impactful reconstruction that I realized my journey still held twists and turns, important decisions and revelations that would continue to shape who I was becoming. Over time, I realized that rebuilding wasn't just about learning to live without him, but above all, about rediscovering who I truly was. For years, my identity was so tied to the role of wife that I forgot to see myself as a woman, as a person, as someone with value independent of any relationship. It was through this process of reflection, therapy, and moments of silent prayer that I began to see a liberating truth. I wasn't defined by the betrayal I suffered, nor the abandonment I faced. I was much more than that. At first, I confess, this revelation seemed like just a nice phrase meant to comfort me, but as I delved deeper into myself, I understood its profound impact. I am more than a betrayed wife. I am a beloved daughter of God. These words began to become a daily reminder, a counterbalance to the internal and external voices that insisted on reducing me to what happened to me. Because if I limited myself to that label, I would be condemned to live forever in the shadow of pain when, in truth, within me, there was so much more light waiting to emerge. This new mindset opened the door for me to dream again. I began to revisit talents I had neglected, passions that had been hidden behind the routine of being a wife and mother. I rediscovered my voice, my perspective, and even the strength of my own hands when I realized I was capable of supporting my home and leading my family, even in the face of loss. The transformation wasn't quick, but it was real, and it showed me that dignity isn't lost when someone rejects us. Dignity is something we carry when we remember who we truly are. Of course, there were still days when the weight of the past insisted on dragging me down, but instead of drowning in it, I learned to use each memory as a springboard to strengthen myself. I no longer saw betrayal as just a scar, but as part of the behind-the-scenes story that shaped the woman I was becoming. And by embracing this journey of rediscovery, I came to understand that my identity wasn't built by the gaze of others, but by the love God has always had for me, a love that never fails, never abandons, never diminishes me. This revelation fueled my next steps, because understanding who I was freed me from the emotional prison that had kept me trapped in the past. And as this new version of myself blossomed, I began to see not just a possible future, but one filled with meaning, purpose, and new decisions that lay ahead. As I began to rediscover who I was, I realized that keeping my story to myself would be like suffocating the transformation God was working within my heart. I understood that silence, the same silence that once imprisoned me, no longer held power over me. It was then that the courage to share arose within me, to transform my pain into a voice, to give my tears a greater purpose than simply wetting the pillow on lonely nights. I decided to speak out, not out of vanity, not to expose wounds in public, but so that other women, perhaps, experiencing exactly what I experienced, would not feel invisible or alone in their journeys. At first, the idea of opening up about my life seemed daunting. I feared judgment, malicious comments, and the indifference of those who prefer to hide behind appearances. But the more I reflected, the more I understood that there was a greater impact behind this decision. What I carried was not only a story of betrayal and abandonment, but also a testimony of transformation, of faith, and of the courage to rise again. And this testimony could become a healing tool for others. I knew from my own experience how cruel loneliness can be, and that was precisely why I decided to break through the barrier of fear. Talking about everything I experienced was simultaneously liberating and challenging. It was like revisiting painful scenes, but now with the mindset that every detail could bring an important revelation to someone in the same valley. I realized that my vulnerability could be the key to empowering other women, showing that there's no shame in admitting wounds, but rather strength in recognizing that pain doesn't define who we are. This understanding gave me a new perspective. Sharing wasn't just about recounting what happened, but about transforming each tear into seeds of hope. It was in this movement of opening up about my story that I felt a profound impact on myself, because by speaking out, I not only helped others see their own dignity, but also cemented within myself the certainty that I had survived, that my voice had value, that my path was being used for something greater. The hidden truth I discovered is that, often, our scars are not just marks of what we've suffered, but living signs of what we've overcome. And it was precisely in this decision to no longer remain silent that I realized my journey had taken on new meaning, because sharing my experience was also a way to heal parts of myself that still hurt. At the same time, I knew this was just the beginning of a new phase, a stage in which my story would cease to be just about survival and become about impact, transformation, and purpose. Looking back and remembering everything I've experienced, I can clearly see that what seemed like the absolute end was actually the beginning of a new journey. The betrayal, as devastating as it was, couldn't define my entire story. The abandonment, as painful as it was, wasn't the final word on my life, because in the midst of so much pain, so many unanswered questions, I discovered a truth that transformed me from within. There is healing in Christ. This revelation didn't come instantly or magically. It was built step by step, through tears and prayers, through days of discouragement and small victories that seemed invisible to others. It was deep down, in those silent conversations with God, that I understood that He didn't see me as a broken woman, but as a beloved daughter, someone with purpose, someone with value. The impact of this was so profound that it changed my mindset. It was no longer about what I had lost, but about what was still being built within me. Hope began to reveal itself not as a fleeting emotion, but as a daily decision, choosing to believe that my future was not doomed to failure, choosing to rise even when the weight seemed unbearable, choosing to see each scar not as shame, but as a testament to overcoming. It was in this movement of choices that I understood betrayal did not nullify me, abandonment did not erase me, because God was writing new chapters in my life, even when I believed there was no more story to tell. And it is precisely this message that I carry with me today. Pain is real, but not eternal. Loss is hard, but not definitive. There is always a chance for transformation, always room for a new beginning. The hope I found in Christ didn't erase the scars, but it showed me that they didn't need to be a period. On the contrary, they became commas in a larger text, revelations. That life can be rebuilt beautifully, even after the rubble. This awareness strengthened me and allowed me to look no longer at what was behind me, but at what was still ahead. Because the truth is, when we understand who sustains us, we realize that we are not limited by someone's abandonment, but driven by the love of a God who never gives up on us. And it was precisely this hope that began to prepare me to take the next step of my journey, a step that, more than ever, would be marked by the freedom to be who I am, and by the confidence that my story still holds greater revelations than I could have imagined. If I could sum up this entire journey in one sentence, it would be this: what seemed like ruin became a new beginning. The betrayal that shattered me, the abandonment that paralyzed me, the shame that tried to silence me, all of this was redefined when I chose not to give in and allowed myself to be rebuilt by the hands of God. My story is not about a tragic ending, but about the strength that arises when we understand that our identity lies not in those who left us, but in the one who never abandons us. And that's why I decided to share all of this here, because I truly believe that each story can be a breath of life for another woman who may be experiencing exactly what I experienced. I know there are those who listen and recognize themselves in every word. I know there are hearts beating faster now because they know they are not alone. And that's precisely why I want to leave a very special invitation here. If this story spoke to you, if at some point it reached your soul and brought a little light amid your own shadows, don't keep it to yourself. Leave a comment, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel. Because it is in this way, together, that we can transform pain into hope, creating a community where no one needs to feel invisible. And more than that, I want to propose something that could become a milestone for all of us. Right here in the comments, what verse has sustained you in times of pain? What promise has been your foundation on days when the ground seems to disappear? By sharing, you not only strengthen your own faith, but also offer a precious gift to another woman who may still be searching for a word that will keep her grounded. Imagine the power of seeing dozens, hundreds of verses forming a chain of support and faith, a living reminder that there is always hope, even when life tries to convince us otherwise. My prayer is that every word of this story has been more than a tale, but a spark of courage for you. Because if I could make it through this valley and find a new life, so can you. Pain may try to define us, but in Christ, we always find a new identity. And together, with our stories, our wounds, and our victories, we can write something even more powerful, a collective testimony of resilience, faith, and love that refuses to be silenced.